as they say in the US. Very few expenses were covered. As a result, we're running a deficit. You have to bear in mind that costs have been incurred. For example, we're short 170 euros, 170 euros to cover the expenses of the rental of this building and the internet and so on and so forth. So on the registration table, we have put a cardboard box, a very large cardboard box. And we are hopeful that each and every one of you can put 1 euro, 10 euros, or 20 euros, depending how much you want to lighten your pockets. But whatever you contribute would be very, very helpful, because we're trying to do our best to be as welcoming and make you as comfortable, both intellectually and in other ways. We need solidarity in this regard. Having done my duty as chair of the Institute, I now want to go on to something very substantial. This wonderful person to my left, that's significant, to my left, which I had the pleasure of meeting, puts me in a whole different space. Because people have asked me in the last number of years, why, of all the human rights struggles throughout the planet, Dimitri, are you particularly engrossed with the fate of the Kurds? My answer is always the same. What the Kurds are doing with other people in the northeastern part of Syria, where they have taken every possible step to not just theorize about gender equality, but to actually practice it. Practice it at every level, conceivable level of public administration and community level. What they are practicing of direct democracy is mind-boggling. Their conceptions of the ecological question are very, very much advanced and very much inspired by many of the ideas that we have been discussing here in this conference. So, to my last breath, I will work for the freedom movement of the Kurdish people, not only in Rojava, but also in the other place across the border, which I have even difficulty naming it. So that is what's driving me and will drive me to the end. Therefore, when I received an invitation from Havin and her colleagues to go to a conference in Hamburg, Germany, a conference that was organized by a number of important activists in Germany, and Havin will explain to us in more details what all that is all about during her presentation and during the question period. When she invited me to go to this massive conference in Hamburg, where there was people like John Holloway and David Harvey and David Greber and Eirik Engan and so on, I didn't take more than 30 seconds to decide that I'm going to go. And when I went there, and it was a gathering that questioned capitalism. It questioned capitalism, and it opened up the whole discussion about where do we go beyond capitalism. And so they were interested both in the theory and practice of a new politics, which was very consistent with what I had learned in a very short period of time about what the Kurds are thinking and acting about. And so I arrived at the airport, and with my colleague Nathan, and there she was in full color, Havin. And of course, typical of the Kurdish and personal culture, we hugged and kissed, and off we went, where we went to a wonderful dinner in the home of a Kurdish family in Hamburg. What a wonderful introduction to a major international conference. And we had this magnificent dinner, and to my right was a man who had just spent 14 years, during his lifetime. And on my left, there were other people who were bloodied by their struggle to establish a free society. That was my introduction at that level. And Havin is at the center of all that. At the center of all that. So we really have an exceptional keynote speaker, and I'm not going to say anything more. It'll come as self-evident when you hear her speak. Havin, welcome to Thessaloniki. Welcome to the Institute.
So, hi everyone. It's nice to be here with all of you. And of course, we are complimenting maybe each other on more negative side. One of the speakers couldn't speak the other day. I can't hear today. So I think though we'll manage to keep each other in action though. Now I will talk a little about the conferences we're doing maybe towards the end. But of course, I would like to talk more about what led to those conferences. And from what everyone has been saying over the last day or so, one can see that what sets us apart, the humans, especially those who are struggling for freedom and to reject injustices and inequalities and oppression and exploitation, is our imagination and our refusal actually to accept what is being handed over to us as being the truth and as being, what the way of life that we should live. So actually, I would like to start here, maybe to explain a little bit about the journey of the Kurdish people and their freedom quest, as well as the strategic thinker, Abdullah Ocalan, who is behind this quest, especially in the last 45 years. Now, just as Brian had talked about Bookchin, Ocalan too is he's more than actually what is known by the whole world to be a leader of the people, of religious issues of ecology, and etc. So where are we coming from? This is what I want to get into a little bit, to be able to holistically understand what happened and why it happened. Because there's a lot of contention on that issue. Some people would like to think that in 1999, suddenly Ocalan got abducted in Kenya, NATO operation, and boom, he began a sociologist, or he became a social ecologist, or something like that. Or some people like to think that he, betrayed the people and of dealing with the situation with the Turkish state and etc. But I would like to lead us through this journey. Obviously, as I said, struggles for freedom are not unique to the Kurdish people or to the region. We've seen it throughout the world. When we look at the last 45 years of the struggle of the PKK, we can see that PKK has continuously and stably developed forward and seen movements and struggles come to the scene and wither away, and be able to analyze these movements. For example, liberation movements. which was Union, the collapse of Soviet Union, feminism, anarchism, and we can count more and more in terms of these. So, but when in the 1970s it was gathering to become a group in order to take up the Kurdish issue, there was limited information available. One could say that in 1971 there was a second coup in Turkey, the first of which was in 1960, and there was only, we can say, the translation available mostly from Russian and French into Turkish of what other people were saying. So there was, in fact, a bit of Marxism, Leninism, Stalinism, a little bit of Maoism, but there was anarchism and other things coming into Turkey in those years. I think one could say that, especially in the 1990s, some of the other alternative movements began to be translated into the Turkish language from English into the Turkish language. So even Italian, I think Gramsci was not even translated until, very recent. Even those who were translated actually were censored, Like there are accounts of translators saying that, how could I have translate the book of Engels on family, when it was against the traditions of the society. So it was censored a lot while they were translated as well. So this was on the side of the world and the developments, the revolutionary developments there. But even the history of the Middle East itself was also very limited knowledge, because it was suppressed so that the nation states that were formed could actually complete the homogenization process that was going on in the area. And least of all, of course, there was the Kurdish history. At all it was not available. And come the 1970s, already they had almost achieved people seeing that Kurdistan was, divided into 4 parts. Maybe they only knew the part that they were in. And it had already began to be officially described in the minds of the Kurdish people themselves that Kurdistan was barren. It was nowhere for one to be living in. It was very backward and stuff like that. So auto-assimilation, in fact, by the 1970s had begun. So this is the situation under which Öcalan and the first grouping is coming together. And especially Öcalan, but also the founding members of the PKK, gave a lot of importance to education and to reading and to be able to draw conclusions from different movements that had already come about by them. So in fiction and non-fiction, there was a lot of reading actually being done at the time. And what is also important is that at the time, the founding members of the PKK were not only Kurdish, and they were not only male, and they were also not only coming from one social class. So there were students, there were workers, there were people, there were females, there were different ethnicities already in the original grouping. So I think this is very important to show what was to come, and that it didn't fall into different categories at all. They started, the first grouping started with 2 words, So I usually say that we would give it a mythical, almost a mythical definition if we said that Öcalan and PKK knew it all. They had arrived at their own paradigm today. Back in the 1970s, that would be wrong. But what would be right is to define both Öcalan and the early group, the people in the group, founding members, to be questioning everything. To question what is being presented to them, even in the form of left, for example. this is why that they started saying, first of all, that Kurdistan was an interstate colony. It's an international colony. So it's not just about Turkey, but it's also about Iran, Iraq, Syria, but it is also about the hegemonic system that they lived in. So therefore, imagine that during these meetings and discussions and questioning and all that, they came to the vision of establishing a party which was Marxist-Leninist, a political party which was Marxist-Leninist. And at the time, this is actually like a Molotov cocktail, if you think about it, because the word Kurds and Kurdistan is banned, prohibited. In the 70s, you couldn't even say Kurdistan or Kurds. You know, you would say K and ... On top of it, not only are you a political party, a movement that demands, but you're Marxist-Leninist at a time when there's the Cold War, you know, and actually we will see later on that none of these countries did not support this movement either. So therefore, they began as like this. And the reason why they saw a need to form a separate a movement from the Turkish left, because we have to say that the PKK was influenced and inspired by the movements around the world as well, like the Vietnamese liberation movement, Frantz Fanon, for example, and of course the Soviet Union itself and Marxism-Leninism in general, and of course the Turkish left. There's an account of the founding members of the PKK and that of Öcalan, where he describes, you know, having this debate with the Turkish left about the situation of the Kurds and etc., and being labeled as nationalism, and that, you know, like we're all proletariat, and that all these can be resolved once there is the revolution of the proletariat and etc. So Öcalan saw, and the founding members saw, that in fact to unite, you had to actually separate first, and, you know, build yourself on your own roots, and then today we're seeing that there is a re-emerging again of coming together. And so there was and Öcalan was, of course, he is also saying that he was very influenced by some of the Turkish left leaders who were later actually either killed by the state, they were killed by the state in general. So the issues there is a little bit more complex, of course, but there was such a situation that was going on there as well. He was also very critical of becoming a disciple of some center, which was the case back then. You know, the movements were either Moscow-oriented, Albanian-oriented, or, you know, China-oriented, or whatever. And Öcalan refused all that as well. You know, he said what needed to be done was to be able to understand Marxism and Leninism, and to be able to implement that back then according to the conditions of Kurdistan. And of course, a lot of people, you know, used to say, yeah, but, you know, there's no proletariat in Kurdistan, so you can't be socialists, you know. So you have to first become a proletariat and then become socialists. So there was all these funny and weird things that were going on in the Middle East back then. So he was also very critical of the real socialism at the time as well. So, I mean, can you imagine the Molotov cocktail here as well? You know, you're not only Kurdish, you're also Marxist-Leninist back in the 70s, if we imagine the situation back then, but you're critical of the left within the Middle East and in Turkey. You're critical of the mainstream left, like whether it's in the form of Soviet Union or China or whatever, and you know, you're already suppressed and deemed non-existent by the nation states that have colonized you, you know. Therefore, this was a it was very difficult to stay alive. This is what I'm trying to say. And therefore, apart from the Kurdish people themselves, there really has been basically no support for the Kurdish movement in general. And the reason why I'm saying all this is that it's because what has been done is there has been a lot of questions asked. This has led the Kurdish movement to question everything that is there, you know, not take anything face value. Because, like, if Soviet Union was what it was claiming to be, why is it ignoring the Kurdish people then? I mean, right? It's declaring that it's Marxist-Leninist as well. And if, let's say, the Turkish left, Iraqi left, Iranian left, or whatever. So all these, actually, what I found was something positive that made it be excluded from the mainstream of all political lines, and allowed them to ask a lot of questions as to why things the way they were. So they did a lot of thinking and doing and thinking. I thought this was something very important that Ocalan says. And to date, he says this, you know. He's a very dialectical thinker in that way as well. He says, you should think as you do and do as you think, so that, you know, you may find different ways of doing and different ways of thinking in this. So, as I said, during the lifetime of the PKK, what else happened was that we saw the collapse of the Soviet Union. And when this did happen, and he was critical about the Soviet Union beforehand, he started analyzing. He didn't give up on socialism or communalism in that sense, but instead he did this analysis where he said insisting on socialism is insisting to be a human being. So I think that was like back in 94, 95 that he did this analysis. And in 96, he did the analysis saying we need to kill the dominant male. 99, there was a lot of re-questioning of how to do things, because he saw what happened to the national liberation movements as well, of Vietnam, you know, what was happening in South Africa and everywhere else. So there was a lot of questioning of that as well. And also, of course, there was a lot of questioning of what they were doing within the PKK. I remember very distinctly that in 97, 98, Öcalan was talking about the real socialist practice within the PKK. And why is this happening, you know? And so there was, the questioning was not only towards the outside, the questioning was also towards the inside. And this is where the thinking, doing, thinking is important. And this is why it's such a dynamic movement. It's not dogmatic, you know. And this is why, perhaps, that until very recently, whoever you asked, you probably got a very negative answer as to what the PKK was, apart from the Kurds, of course. You know, we always like them. But if you ask anybody else, you know, like the left wing would say they are nationalist, the religious would say they are atheist, you know, the communists would say they are Stalinist, Orthodox Stalinist, and etc., you know. So you would definitely, Alevi would say they are Sunni, Sunni would say they are Alevi, you know, the Turks would say they are Armenian, because, oh God, it's a terrible word to say, Armenian, you know, it's like a blasphemy kind of a thing. So you would get all these descriptions about one and the same organization and movement, apart from the Kurdish people themselves. So what he did, and the founding members and everyone together, because you have to see that there's been a lot of discussion of things within the PKK, a lot of reading, but a lot of discussions as well. Öcalan would have this setting of a school garden kind of a thing. He would actually liken it to the Socrates garden, you know, where with the revolutionaries of the organization, he would discuss, you know, the developments, the problems of the organization, the questions that face the movement, the questions that face humanity in general, or revolutionary people in general, and the society, of course. So, and therefore, he drew a lot of conclusions from what happened. He would never be affected negatively. Instead, he would go and re-question and understand why things went as wrong as they did. Because he would say that, you know, like, you can't really question the intentions of the people. For Soviet revolution, for example, he says, can really question the intention of the people who made the revolution. But what we need to question is, instead of that, the tools and the means and the meanings that were given to things, and to go back and re-question these. And he did this with feminism as well. You know, feminism is great to show the freedom loss of women, to make this visible, but to see where did it go wrong that it became elite and didn't have a big grounding, deep-rooted within the people. Where are things going wrong? So all these things were questioned in a very great deal. And of course, there are pragmatic steps as well, like at the beginning, and this is one question that Ocalan saw the key, and perhaps I will talk a little bit about how he got inspired by Bookchin as a result, was the question of the state, you know. Because the left, right, whoever, you know, nobody really steered apart from anarchism, but they didn't really offer something else, the anarchism that we knew. So therefore, the freedom movement at the beginning too thought of independent and free socialist Kurdistan, okay, but in a Middle Eastern confederation. So there was always this reunification at some point, somehow. So this was the way that things at the beginning even was discussed. Now, in 1993, for the very first time, and everybody thought it was really tactical, Ocalan said that there could be talks with Turkey, and there could be a solution find between the borders, inside the borders of Turkey, the official borders of Turkey. Why am I saying this? Although at a time that was more practical step than a paradigmatic one, first time that Ocalan actually broke away with the idea of a completely separate state, and at a practical level approached the issue that could be resolved within the borders of the Turkish state. So before 99, you know, we're talking about a whole world of discussions, including the women's freedom issue, of course. I should really point this out as well. Although the dimension of freedom for women, not just as it did in any other political party or national liberation movement, as a branch of that party, it was formed. But in the early 1990s, there was a huge influx of young men into the organization. And of course, PKK represented a hope for freedom, not only ethnic repression that was on the Kurds. I mean, basically, as Kurds, they were almost wiped out, but also it brought the hope of freedom in relation to social relations, because the PKK was Marxist-Leninist. Therefore, it rejected feudal relations. Therefore, it rejected the approach to women. In fact, the PKK, before they fought the state, between the feudal lords within Kurdistan, because the feudal lords as agents of the state, would not allow the PKK to grow within Kurdistan. So they fought it off so that it would not enter into the society. So it was first the feudal lords that showed resistance to this movement. So, you know, in saying all this, back in Ocalan was Kenya, as I said, as a result of a NATO operation, with US in the lead, UK, Israel, and etc. He was handed over to Turkey. There was all these discussions in the background, and there was also, of course, need for Öcalan to find a solution to what was happening to the Kurds. If you who know the Kurdish history would know, actually, that within the Kurdish history, what happens is that the rebellions are actually out by capturing the leader, killing the leader, and then massacring. So the Kurds were very much aware of this reality. You know, there was 20-odd rebellions in the near past of the Kurds, and they experienced this day in and day out. So when Öcalan was captured, everyone around the world, all the Kurds were on the streets protesting what they knew that was coming if he was actually killed in the hands of the Turkish state. Because both historically this was the case, and also their freedom aspirations were in danger. So there's such a very strong link between how the Kurds see Öcalan and what it represents for the Kurdish people historically and presently. And of course, he's a tested leader who has shown, you know, from non-existent situation of the Kurds, because the Turkish state wrote volumes on how the Kurds were mountain Turks. To say this and to use it against them now, the state ideology, that, you know, they are mountainous people. So when they walk in the mountains in the snow, they make the sound of kart, kurt, kart, kurt. That's where the Kurd comes from. So they are not, can you imagine? And this was rational thinking by the university professors in Turkey. So in fact, you know, there's been with this is of course a big rupture in the history of the Kurdish freedom movement, but in the history of the Kurds in general, because of what it represented and because of the way Öcalan actually made use of this rupture, you know, because there was two things that was imposed on him. You know, I know that many of the movements within the Middle East, but especially in Turkey, called on the PKK fighters and revolutionaries to take their weapons and come to them, because their leader had just, you know, betrayed them. And then there were also those who expected him to go on a hunger strike or something, you know. And but instead, what he did was to ask for cow, because there were a lot of people, as a result of what I'm explaining, went onto the streets and burned themselves alive. Came to the whole world. You know, what the hell are they doing? Why are they burning themselves on the streets? Yeah. And so this stopped a lot of things, of course. This stopped the fact that, you know, something happening to Öcalan on the way from Kenya to Turkey. But on top of it, Öcalan, having these questions before 99 as well, and having this rupture where he could see the intervention of the world system into the Middle East, and he begins it with the intervention of him being forced out of 1998. Because, let me open a parenthesis here, because it's a little bit complex, because a lot of issues are all happening at once. In the personage of the Kurdish people's freedom struggle. he says that in one of his books, I think it's also here in English, he says that in 98, envoy to him. They wanted him to accept their patronage in the Kurdish question and its resolution. He doesn't explain furthermore and how they wanted it, but I think we're seeing how things are being played out. And Ocalan says that neither morally nor politically I couldn't accept this. And as a result, the ordeal or the odyssey, which the Kurds call the international plot, began on the 9th of October. Now, this rupture he used positively. He had more time to read in prison. Therefore, he asked for a lot of different books. I think he's read like thousands of books in prison. And one of them was, of course, that of Bookchin's. So one could say, I mean, Brian was telling us how Bookchin was almost forgotten. But one could say that Kurdish freedom movement is the largest and the most influential freedom movement in the world that has been inspired by Bookchin. Just as, let's say, in the 1970s, where, you know, as I said, it was a Molotov cocktail to be Marxist-Leninist and on top of it Kurdish, you know, in such an area, again in the 2000s, just when people expected something else of him, you know, suddenly he says, okay, we don't want a state. You know, can you imagine everybody here? Some people said, okay, it's out of fear. You know, some people said, I don't know, it's out of, you know, his personal fear or whatever, you know, okay, so the Kurds thought, okay, he's doing tactics. It's tactical, definitely, because everybody, you know, in the world, people without a state, I always give this example, are like people who are born fatherless bastards, you know, because you get to be bullied, you know, you get to be massacred in and out. So therefore, you aspire to have a state. You think this is where the liberation is. This is how you will become free. So I think it helped what Bookchin had written. His books had helped immensely to find his own questions on a more of a philosophical background. Therefore, he went into questioning. He went into questioning the state especially, because that was, he thought, one of the traps that most of the left fell into, you know. So he wanted to see where this comes from. He also found the question of women's freedom very important personally, as well as the things that had happened inside the movement. You remember I said that in the 90s, a lot of young women and men came, and with it, like at the beginning, they were mostly university students, but in the 90s, it became more popular movement. Like, you know, normal people from villages, suburbs, the cities came, and some of them were university students, but some of them weren't. So the question of the development of the individual also became very important. You know, thus the real socialism within the movement as well. Even this was actually seen even at the beginning. This is why PKK itself means a rupture from the life as we know it, you know. As they formed, what they did was they stopped entering the relations of the system. Like, they don't get married, for example. They don't just not get married, they question sexual relations. I don't mean, maybe I should open this further later, but love, sex, marriage, family, and they question a lot of the things that we take for granted, you know, family relations, working for money, for example. They questioned this even from the beginning. So they had a clear rupture in this sense as well from the system. So they stopped actually living and working in the system. They tried this from the outside, from the beginning. So as Ocalan questioned all this, he got in deeper and deeper, and he reached some conclusions. You know, like he looked at how slavery is built actually, and he bases it on three ways. And as Brian pointed out with Bookchin as well, that it doesn't happen just on the sheer use of violence. You know, it is coupled with other things. And the difference, I think, that there's between Ocalan and Bookchin is that he stretches it back to the Neolithic, and he starts the issue of class, nation, you know, with the loss of freedom of women and her system. So parts from feminism as well. He doesn't take the issue of the freedom loss of women as a sex, but he sees it, you know, as the loss of moral and political society that she was the founder, the guide of, you know. So therefore, he says, for that society to lose, the woman had to lose. And he begins the state society as the institutionalization of patriarchy, you know. So it's not to say that there was no hierarchy or domination, or let's say hierarchy, especially from before, but what the status class civilization that as we know it begins with the institutionalization of hierarchy, and not just hierarchy alone. So this is very important. And he says that, for example, when violence wasn't enough, of course, intertwinedly, ideological narrative had to come into play, and mostly religious, of course, as Brian pointed out as well. And we're seeing it in all the mythologies, for example. This is why Ocalan likes calling his method interpretive as well. He looks at the mythologies. He looks at what the mythologies are trying to say in terms of this struggle, you know. And as a result, you know, he says that there's also this ideological narrative that is coupled with this violence. So, you know, if you're not accepting what is going on by the sheer force, then there's this ideological side. If you're not accepting that, then your livelihood, economy is being taken away from you, you know. So you're made dependent in terms of economy as well. So all these three things are actually the way to build slavery. Then he extends this to everybody else, you know, to nature, you know, because we have an ideological narrative with the nature, you know, with this subject-object dichotomy, you know, as if it's lifeless, it's at our disposal or whatever. Oh, we need it, we have to do it, and whatever, you know. And with peoples as well. Like he looks at how Kurds were actually forced into non-existence, and he can see that it's been done on these three dimensions as well, you know. Violence is used, extreme violence is used, you know. Our cities have just been destroyed, and maybe Ercan will talk further on this as well. But if that's not enough, there is an ideological construction. Before, when nobody knew that Kurds existed, you know, I love to say this as well. My dad told me personally that when he used to go to high school, primary school, he went to a Turkish village for the first time. And there, all the kids said to him, "Where's your tail? Where's your tail?" You know, there's no tail. You know, he went home and he said, "Mom, where's my tail?" You know, because Kurds are animals, you know, because only animals have tails, or that they are dirty, or that they have incest, or whatever you will get. Probably a lot of the indigenous people get this around the world anyway, or people whom you want to dispose of. And this also helps into auto-assimilation, because who wants to be from a culture with people who have tails or who are dirty or whatever? If that doesn't convince you, the violence, the ideological narrative, there's also always the economical aspect of it, that you will not have a bright future if you're Kurdish. If you have an accent on your Turkish, you will not get into, public office, or you will not get anywhere at all, So these are the three things that go hand in hand as well. So he is therefore trying to look at what happened to what he calls the moral and political society throughout history. So his starting point is the Kurdish question and the Kurdish people and what happened to them. But throughout these 40-odd years, because of asking all these questions and the impossibility of resolving the Kurdish question due to, international, national, regional issues, he came to a point where he actually, in depth, tried to understand what was happening to us as humans. And this is why in the 2000s, while everybody was expecting him to do something else, he came up with democratic confederalism, a non-state solution, not just to the Kurdish question, but to the questions that we are actually experiencing around the world. I don't know how much time I have.
You have put it on overtime already.
I'm overtime already. Well, anyway.
Keep going.
Bookchin was very important for Ocalan, as I said, especially some books, that he was able to read, and he asked more and more of those that were translated into Turkish. In 1999, for the very first time, with local elections in Turkey, Kurds began to, be active in the municipalities. They got into elections and became mayors and members of the municipalities, etc. And so it was basically, he told all the mayors to read, the book called Urbanization Without Cities. He told all the mayors to have one book on that table and to study it and to read it. So he was really interested in how to make the municipalities, a tool in terms of what Bookchin was talking about. And of course, his favorite, and he studied this quite a bit, is The Ecology of Freedom. And to resonate that, the third book that will come out is called Sociology of Freedom by Ocalan. So, and in fact, the book that reflects or inspiration by Bookchin is a book that is newly being translated. These books that you can see, and it's a huge book, and it's the foundation of the Manifesto for a Democratic Civilization of the 2 volumes you see here, is where he deals actually with all these hierarchies, domination, and the state theory, and everything else. So, but I'm over time, and I'm just gonna now say, from here is this. So where is the solution? So he looked at it and he said, okay, ideological narrative, violence. The third is economic. This is how we are enslaved. So where are the answers lying in here? So he said, one, okay, we're not the first to give this freedom struggle. We are a part and a link to this chain. But this chain is dispersed. It needs to be brought together. So what he's done is he's attempting to actually, and he calls it an essay, actually, of sociology of freedom. He attempts to bring together the history of the communities, the people, the women who struggle for freedom. So if there is a history of states, of domination, of hierarchy, of this city, class, state civilization. Then there is the civilization, which he calls democratic civilization, of peoples, women, workers, you know, craftspeople, clans, tribes, who resisted all these centralizations and everything else. So therefore he says, okay, I'm not doing something new, I'm just trying to make visible what is there, you know. So therefore, his unit of looking at history is moral and political society, which, you know, Bookchin calls more like organic, I think, society. But he bases this moral and political society more on the freedom loss of women. So women is a very key agent there. Oh, I don't want to call it agent. I don't know. This English language is a little bit different because it gives it a very tool-like thing, and it's not like that. So it's very fundamental to this freedom struggle, and therefore he goes in and redefines that. Okay, he says the freedom struggles of the past, revolutionary movements of the past, fell into some traps about this violence and the army and the military issues, including the PKK. So how do we redefine this? Because there is an extraordinary violence being applied against the people at the moment, even at the moment. It's not just economic, it's sheer physical violence at the same time. So, you know, there needs to be, and he calls it self-defense, to protect yourself, not to go and occupy or to do whatever, to attack or whatever, but to protect yourself. So he feels that there needs to be a force that needs to open space up for this, you know. The second thing is, of course, the ideological aspect. This is why there is genealogy, for example, so that women can also decide on what their history is and to work this out, you know, not just rely on the history that is given to us. And of course, again, the history of also the peoples. And also, of course, economics as well. How do we become independent of the state structures, you know? Because states today, we can see, are grabbing people off their land, you know, and putting them on the road everywhere, especially in the Middle East, but everywhere else around the world. And we are seeing reconquering of geographies, you know, and their land and their riches. And through them, they are making European United States or the wider Anglo-Saxon world a little bit more scared and to go and embrace the state even more, to protect them against what's coming. So they are using populations against one another through economics. So how do we develop an independent economics and living from the state as well? So this is what it boils down to, actually. Ocalan is saying that state cannot be conquered and then, you know, and then you make it useless and then you have a classless society. No, he says, forget about that. We will have organizations, parties that will try to neutralize this state. But what is really important is to organize the people so they can, in fact, create their spaces independent of the state, which is nothing but a monopoly and the peak of all the monopolies of different monopolies that have come throughout the time, you know, military, ideological, cultural, industrial, I don't know, whatever, money, you know. So he's against the idea of monopoly as well. So he's separating governance from the state, and he's creating tools like democratic autonomy that can actually find a compromise with the state. Goes over boundaries. It goes over to us as an individual as well. We cannot expect to change the system if we don't change. But our changing cannot be individual. We need to have a mechanism for that. And this is why there is extreme, I don't want to call that, but it's extreme, yeah, of organization of the society. Because we're seeing capitalism, and Ocalan is saying there, it's attempting socialicide. Is there a word like that? You know, to kill the society. He's saying this is the biggest problem at the moment. And so he's not calling for a vanguard, but what he is saying, that what the revolutionaries should do is to keep off these forces so the moral and political society has the space to reawaken and to refunction, you know, and this is a process that needs to be dynamic. I'm over and over time, but it's been very, I tried to give it in a nutshell, but it's difficult. So it's the soul of the matter. So whatever format you have doesn't help if the soul is not in the right spot. But the soul needs to be accompanied with tools that can further it, you know. And he says, we do not have to define, you know, like the nation state defines itself on nationalism, you know. So how do we define ourselves, what the mindset that we're on? Just like Bookchin, freedom. So this is something dynamic and it can change, you know, but nation doesn't, you know, like nation is really static. And that's why he calls the woman the first nation as well, you know. So, and he defines democratic nation on two very important pillars, freedom and also solidarity. Need. Thank you.
Well, that's fantastic. Thank you so much, Havin. Thank you so much. It has been recorded and will be viewed by many, many, many people, hopefully in days and years to come. And I want to call upon another member of our advisory council, Malin, to come forward and to animate the discussion and question period.
Okay.
Do you want to do it?
Yes, go ahead.
Yes.
You.
Yeah. We are already over time, so we need to be very short, and then we can blend because the next session goes very much into the same theme. So if we can also address question there.
Yeah.
So some questions now,
Yeah.
and some more questions after the next.
Yeah.
This will be the same. So how much time for this?
You just go up there and
Well,
we take
5
control of the
minutes.
situation.
5
Sorry
minutes.
about
No, no, no.
More than 5. Mullins.
Or we make the workshop shorter or something. We need to get to the book launch at least. That's the time.
Yeah. So 10 minutes or
Yeah.
10 minutes, and we have more later on. Yeah. So take this one. Yeah. I think it's okay. All right. So I was just asked now to facilitate the questions, and as well, I think it's a good practice is as well as I don't have so much time to have not more than 2 minutes. So like if you have a comment or questions, think how to make it like think and concrete, like short. So we take up some few questions and you can answer.
Mhm.
Yeah, I think we'll, because of the time, we'll do it like that. Yeah. So questions and comments or thoughts. You're welcome. Come forward, and I think, yeah.
One question is, and maybe how much do you think the people, the herds of the movement are now dependent on Ocalan as an ideological leader? If, for example, if he ceased to exist, to say, I don't know, if the movement could go on without being so much affected.
Was it clear?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I take more.
We get to be asked that a lot, so I understand that very much.
more from Rostock. My question is, what is this avant-garde? Is it necessary to have the organization, or is this? Can we have everything on the basic organizational level, like only communalistic meetings, essentially, or do we need avant-garde organization?
Yeah. Yeah.
I'd like to know if this confederalism has been shared with other fight for independence, because it's very interesting, this idea of living Catalonia, and this idea of confederalism. Has it been spread out with other fight for independence? Or for freedom of people?
I think we have just time for one more question. We have two hands.
Two more questions.
Two more questions, and then I think we need to, because we don't have time to answer them all otherwise. I think. Yeah?
I know that Ocalan talks a lot about democratic confederalism as an idea and a movement for the whole of the Middle East, not just the Kurds. And you mentioned earlier that the Kurdish movement was that the revolution for the Kurds was always something for the whole of the Middle East, and not just the Kurds. What is the interaction with the Kurdish movement and other movements in the Middle East? Like, I know that in Java, there's been an amazing harmony between the different peoples, but outside of there, like for example, in the Arab Spring, the other Arab movements don't always have a very clear link with the Kurdish movement. So I'd like to know if there are other movements that they have a strong link.
Last one, and then
There's another.
yeah, but I don't think it was the line. You provide, remember, and for the next 10. Yeah.
I can pass my to someone who'd like to ask the question.
You want to pass it to you?
If someone would like to ask.
Ocalan has said something particular about the economic system, which I think is a very important issue. If he has said something, and if not, what is at Rojava? What is the economic system they use between them? Do they have some kind of particular other currency or whatever system they have?
Yep.
Okay, it's
So you have 5 minutes.
yeah, there are practical and also theoretical issues all at once, and this was the difficulty actually giving this talk, this interaction with you, because there are lively matters that are going on. It's 2014. The Kurds are under the clasp of genocide. ISIS began from one end, Shengal, they even came into Iraqi Kurdistan, and Turkey from Bakur. And Iran is still a sleeping cell, It's waiting to be active at the moment. And it's one of the main classical forces, hegemonies in the Middle East that is not allowing for the solution of the Kurdish issue. And more, of course, because they will be overcome themselves, all these states, at the same time. So, but starting with the Ocalan question of Nikki. Now, there are many connotations to this question, because sometimes the way it is said, and I don't know which way Nikki is asking, but there's been a lot of, and I'm sure Nikki is not asking in that sense, but I want to say this, there's been a lot of effort by European system imposed on the Kurds and the Kurdish freedom movement to say, why Öcalan, just let him go. I mean, the time of the leaders is past, I mean, yeah, let's all people come together, we'll take decisions, you know, but why was there such philosophers and thinkers, you know, during time? And I think what we need to acknowledge and see, because today we talked about Bookchin here, and we said from Bookchin to Ocalan, and we didn't say this for nothing. Just as Bookchin had been influenced and affected, inspired by people before him, and I think this is where they are connected so very much. He didn't just take it on, he criticized, critically viewed it, and he fused it into something else, you know. And this is what Ocalan is also doing. You know, his point of departure is the colonization of the Kurds. But from there, he's moving to see how this 5,000 years of patriarchy has taken us like prisoners, you know, that we keep on regenerating it, you know, and he's questioned all the tools used to regenerate this colonization process for all peoples and women. So therefore, we need to see Ocalan in that light a little bit. And I think in 1999 and afterwards, the Kurds showed that their ideological and their political and organizational and human potential was enough to take this on and continue with it. So I think there's no question in that. But this does not automatically lead us to the conclusion that there is no need for Ocalan. There is need for everybody, you know, and especially when he is the kind of person who is able to actually go profoundly into philosophical, political, economical, you know, anthropological, and all these issues, you know. He really does do an anthropology of religion, anthropology of state, you know. And, you know, he's the guy who came up with the slogan, Jin Jian Azadi, which is, you know, if you've seen the brochure here, the Kurdish language has this connection between life and woman. Jin is woman and Jian is life. He's no linguist. He focused so much that he saw this connection in the roots of our lives, memory of before, you know, and therefore I think we have to see him in that light as well. But of course, he's also a hands-on practical leader, you know. What he's doing, also trying to figure out the tools that we need to use that are separate from this hierarchy, domination, state tools, and go into that path of freedom. What Brian said was Ocalan feels the same as Bookchin, that if this hierarchy, domination, and state mechanism don't impose on us, there's a tendency for freedom. He even says, you know, what is the singing of the birds if not longing for freedom? So the joy of life, you know, and so in that sense, I think his position is important. The avant-garde, as I said,
it's been 5 minutes.
Oh, okay.
So,
okay.
I think.
That's the question.
I think we should think of
I agree. Maybe
should we address the questions after urgents? Because we remember the questions because they're good questions.
We have two presentations in the next sessions. Yeah.
Okay.
We'll blend in these answers to these questions in the session that we're going to have all together on the same terrain, on the same
Yes.
And I transfer the responses to be made to Ercan.
Yeah. And then we will end this session here with a statement from me as instructed by my colleague Nathan. When we quote Ocalan, who ordered, or heavily suggested, if you will, that all co-mayors of all Kurdish municipalities should read this book. and they should have it at hand. And so this book is still available here. I'm surprised that we still have copies. You cannot understand what we're trying to do with TRISE if you don't read this book. And you could understand that for only 15 euros.
Okay, it's 5 minutes break enough?
5 minutes.
That's